There is a version of you that used to exist, and one day, without warning, it quietly died. Not with a funeral. Not with tears. It died in silence, in an ordinary moment you almost missed completely. Maybe it was a text you never got back. Maybe it was a mirror you couldn't look into. Maybe it was the exact second you realized you'd been lying to yourself for years. And once that moment hits you, there's no rewind button. You see how small you've made yourself to keep others comfortable. You see how much of your happiness was just permission you were waiting for. You see the years you spent chasing approval from people who never once chased you back. Because once you see the cage, you can't unsee the bars. Once you feel the weight you've been carrying, you can't pretend it's not there anymore. Once you notice this one thing, your old life ends, and something braver, rawer, and infinitely more real begins to take its place. Let me tell you something most people will never admit to themselves, no matter how deeply they feel it in the quiet corners of their own mind. You have been carrying a version of yourself that was built entirely for survival, not for truth, and you built it so long ago that you forgot it was ever a choice. Every smile you forced in front of people who hurt you was a quiet negotiation with a world that punished honesty and rewarded silence instead. You whispered the words, "I'm fine," more times than you can count, even when you were breaking apart quietly on the inside where no one could see the damage. That was never weakness, no matter what anyone told you about it back then. That was a heart that learned far too early that vulnerability came with a painful price attached to it. Think carefully about the people you have shrunk yourself for over the years, the ones who never even noticed the sacrifice. Think about the rooms where you stayed quiet so no one else would feel even slightly uncomfortable around your presence. Think about the dreams you buried in silence because someone once laughed at them carelessly, without ever understanding what those dreams meant to you. You called it being humble when really it was self-erasure disguised as virtue. You called it being easy to love when really it meant loving yourself less every single day. But somewhere along that long and exhausting road, being agreeable became something else entirely, something far more dangerous than you ever realized. It became disappearing, one quiet sacrifice at a time, until there was barely anything left of the person you used to be. No one ever forced you into this slow vanishing act, and that truth is the hardest part to accept. You did it willingly, believing with your whole heart that it would finally make you enough for someone who mattered. But enough for who, exactly, when you really stopped to think about it honestly? For people who never once asked what you truly needed from them in return. For a world that only clapped for you when you performed the role it wanted to see. This is where it starts to break, not violently, but quietly, the way glass cracks long before it ever shatters completely. And once that crack finally reaches the surface of your life, there is no pretending anymore that everything is fine. After this moment, a new question begins to form inside you, one you never had the courage to ask yourself before now. If I have sacrificed so much of myself for everyone else, then why does this emptiness still live inside my chest every single night? Maybe the answer is exactly the thing you have been avoiding for years, hidden beneath layers of distraction and forced positivity. You tied your happiness to other people's approval without ever realizing that this was a game you could never actually win. Every time someone praised you, you believed relief was finally arriving, only to feel it slip away again within minutes. This pattern repeated for years, and somewhere along the way, you lost track of what you were even chasing anymore. You told yourself that if you just tried a little harder, loved a little louder, gave a little more of yourself away, then finally someone would see you the way you needed to be seen. But the harder you tried, the more invisible you somehow became to the very people you were trying to reach. That is the cruel irony no one warns you about when you build your worth on other people's opinions. Somewhere between all those forced smiles and quiet compromises, you stopped asking yourself the one question that actually mattered. Not what does everyone else need from me, but what do I actually need for myself? That single question, once it finally surfaces, cannot be pushed back down again no matter how hard you try. Because once you start asking real questions instead of performing real answers, something inside you begins to wake up from a very long sleep. It is uncomfortable, it is disorienting, and at first it feels like losing everything you built your identity around. But this discomfort is not destruction, it is the very first sign that transformation has already begun inside you. There comes a point where you realize the people you tried hardest to keep happy were never actually watching how much you were breaking inside for them. You gave your energy, your time, your softest moments to relationships that only took and rarely gave anything back in return. And the worst part is that you convinced yourself this imbalance was simply what love was supposed to feel like. You learned to read rooms before you even learned to read your own emotions clearly. You knew exactly when to stay quiet, exactly when to laugh at jokes that hurt you, exactly when to shrink so someone else could feel bigger beside you. This skill kept you safe for years, but safety and happiness were never actually the same thing. Somewhere inside you always knew this arrangement was unsustainable, even when you refused to admit it out loud to anyone. You felt the exhaustion building slowly beneath your ribs every single time you gave more than you had left to give. But admitting exhaustion felt like admitting failure, so instead you just kept pouring from a cup that had been empty for a very long time. Now, that exhaustion has a name, and once you name it, it becomes impossible to unsee everywhere in your life. It is the exhaustion of abandoning yourself repeatedly in order to belong somewhere that never truly wanted the real you anyway. And once you see this pattern clearly, you cannot keep walking the same road pretending it leads somewhere different this time. Something inside you begins quietly preparing to choose differently, even if you are still terrified of what that choice will cost you. This is not betrayal of the people you love. This is the beginning of finally belonging to yourself first, perhaps for the very first time in your entire life. Once you begin choosing yourself, you will notice something strange happening around you, something no one prepares you for in advance. Some people who claim to love you unconditionally will suddenly grow distant, cold, even resentful of the new boundaries you are learning to hold. This happens not because you did something wrong, but because your silence and self-sacrifice were quietly convenient for them. For years, your compliance kept the peace in every room you entered, and now your voice threatens a balance that was never actually fair to you. This is one of the loneliest parts of waking up, realizing that some relationships were only ever built on your willingness to disappear quietly. It does not mean those people never loved you, but it means their love had conditions you were never told about. You will grieve this, and that grief is valid, real, and deserves space instead of being rushed or dismissed by anyone including yourself. Grieving the version of your life that felt familiar, even when it was slowly hurting you, is a necessary part of becoming someone new. There is no growth without loss, and there is no awakening without leaving something behind in the process. But something else begins happening at the exact same time, something far quieter and far more powerful than the loss you are feeling. New space begins opening inside you, space you did not even know existed because it had been filled with other people's expectations for so long. And into that space, for the first time in years, your own voice finally has room to breathe. You start noticing small things again, the sound of your own laughter, the color of the sky, the feeling of simply existing without performing for anyone. These moments feel unfamiliar at first, almost foreign, because you had forgotten what peace without exhaustion actually feels like inside your body. This is not the end of your story. This is the very first page of a life that finally belongs entirely to you. There is a version of you standing on the other side of everything you are feeling right now, and that version is not afraid anymore. That version has stopped shrinking, stopped apologizing for taking up space, stopped waiting for permission to simply exist as they truly are. That version of you is not a fantasy or a distant dream, it is a person who is already forming quietly inside you at this very moment. You do not need anyone's approval to begin this transformation, and you never actually did, even during all those years you believed otherwise. The permission you have been waiting for your entire life was never going to come from someone else. It was always meant to come from you, the moment you finally decided you were done disappearing. This awakening you are feeling right now, this discomfort, this quiet fire building in your chest, it is not something to fear or suppress any longer. It is the truest part of you finally refusing to stay silent after years of being buried beneath everyone else's expectations. Let it rise. Let it speak. Let it lead you somewhere your old self never had the courage to go. You will lose people along this path, and some days that loss will ache more than you expected it to. But you will also meet a version of yourself so honest, so whole, so deeply at peace, that every sacrifice will finally make complete sense. This is not the ending of who you were. This is the beginning of who you were always meant to become. So if something inside you shifted while listening to this, if some part of you recognized itself in every single word, then you already know the truth. You cannot go back now. You cannot unsee what you have seen, unfeel what you have felt, or unknow what you now know about yourself. So take a breath. Take one single step forward today, however small it feels. Because the person you are becoming is already waiting for you on the other side of this exact moment, and they have never been more ready to finally meet you.